Hello. Thank you for tuning into Recipe Lab this afternoon, although it is evening where our chefs are this time. We're happy to have Sami Tamimi and Yotam Ottolenghi, the authors of Jerusalem, a cookbook, which has become a surprising smash hit here in the States and is also very popular sort of all over the English-speaking world. They have restaurants in London and have written a book about their native city, Jerusalem. And we are also joined by 3 home cooks who responded to our Recipe Lab posts and have made their chicken with caramelized onions and cardamom rice. That recipe actually was chosen by New York Times readers. We asked them what their favorite recipe from the book was, because the book did come out last fall and has sort of become, been growing gradually, often by social media. There is a hashtag devoted to it called Tasting Jerusalem, and some other interesting features that kind of helped it become popular. So welcome from London.
Hi Julia, hi everybody.
And here are our home cooks. Kirsten?
Hi, my name is Kirsten, and I'm a student at the University of Chicago, and I regularly cook from the Jerusalem Cookbook as part of a Friday night dinner club that I belong to with several of my college friends.
And Ruth?
My name is Ruth Yutkovich. I was born and raised in New York, and I've been living in Jerusalem for over 30 years. I have a small home-based business called Shuk and Cook, where I take groups of mostly tourists to Machane Yehuda, Jerusalem's open-air market, and then bring them back to my home for a cooking workshop and a meal.
Hi, my name is Sanjay. I'm born and raised in Mumbai in India, and I'm really excited about this book because it bridges the gap for me between the flavors and the spices that I grew up with and the ingredients and techniques that I cook with on a day-to-day basis in New York.
And I think that many people responded to this recipe particularly because it seems to have many different flavors that appeal, you know, the whole spices from Sanjay's background and just that familiarity of chicken and rice together. So authors, tell us a little bit what inspired this particular recipe in Jerusalem.
What inspired this particular recipe is a bunch of things, and this is quite typical for the book. It doesn't have one kind of background where you can say this comes from this community or that community, but it has a few very kind of clear signature marks of Jerusalem. First of all, it's a whole dish in one pot, which is typical for both the Palestinian and the Jewish communities in Jerusalem, various Jewish communities that, you know, for a Friday night dinner or for feeding a whole family, especially in the old days where, you know, you didn't have time to wash up and you didn't have so many pots, things were cooked in one pot and, you know, left to sit for many hours, and that would be the pot that would feed the whole family over a weekend or over a day. So that's the one thing. The other, it's a kind of a pilav, which is very typical for various communities in Jerusalem. Again, you can see similar dishes in Arab culture, but also various Jewish cultures. Jews that came from Georgia, from Persia, from all the parts of the Eastern Mediterranean have made all their pilavs, which is essentially rice cooked with slowly with various other elements, and then kind of bejeweled with all sorts of other wonderful things. And then we added the chicken because we thought, you know, that is just a wonderful thing to have a everybody likes chicken, you know. It's normally when you ask what recipe did you cook, they say, oh, I cooked the chicken recipe, because it's always the kind of the most immediate thing to cook, and that's we added that to the rice, so it's a kind of pilav with chicken pieces in it, and everything cooks together, and obviously the spices flavor the chicken and the rice.
Well, also there's the element of it's a cheap dish to do, and when you have people in Jerusalem they're quite poor, and to cook such a big meal for a family, you know, sometimes they use a little bit of meat and more grains and rice, and yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons for the book's popularity here, is that there are so many people here who are trying to do that, use meat more as a condiment, and also vegetarians and vegans. We have several people, home cooks here, who are sort of on that spectrum. Ruth, I know you are at least a partial vegetarian, but tell us how you made the dish. I know you made it more than once.
Right, I made it twice. The first time I made it was this past Friday afternoon. I made it with a group of a family actually. First of all, they got so excited when they heard that it was from this cookbook. And you guys are like rock stars, I think, in cooking circles. Like I said, we had a little bit of problem with the rice, but everything turned out delicious. And I think especially when you're on vacation and you're cooking, there's just something really wonderful, and it's almost like very instant gratification to eat something delicious that you've made and shopped for. Today I made it. I don't eat poultry and I don't eat beef. I do eat fish. I debated doing it with fish, but then I decided, because I had guests who were vegetarians, I did it with vegetables, and it was fantastic. I just instead of chicken, I just did I followed exactly the same instructions, but I used like wedges of eggplant, so a couple of small whole zucchinis, and carrots. And then I laid them, of course, on top like I would have done with the chicken, and it was delicious. It was delicious.
Did you still use water, or did you use a vegetable stock to cook
No, I used water. I used water, but I think that the spices are rich enough that it does the trick.
Yeah. And you know, I have to add that we said it before we went on air. The issue with the rice cooking versus the chicken, and that's one of the issues with cooking, you know, a starch and rice in the same pot, just to get the timing exactly right. And this is something you need to kind of judge as you cook it, because when we tested it with one brand of rice and another type of chicken, and the water content varies quite a lot. So this is this kind of thing that you need to judge as you cook, whether the rice is completely soft and whether the chicken is just cooked.
And I mean, the fact that this dish is popular, I mean, we always say that our recipes are for the home cook, something that you would like to do at home. And you know, some people get familiar with the dish, also with the recipe, and they cook it once, and then we always say that we are happy that people change the recipe slightly to adapt to their needs, or to just get familiar more with, and then you can add things or take things out of the recipe.
We're not recipe Nazis.
I wanted to add one more thing. I mean, this issue with the rice and the chicken, I was just thinking now while we're talking, is maybe the chicken can be cut smaller pieces, and then it needs less time to cook.
Yeah.
And like this would be equal with the rice.
I think that would be one. You know, some people felt that it wasn't enough water. Some people felt that it was too much water. So, and it also, I think, has a great, just from a practical standpoint, it makes a very big difference what heat you cook it on. And at least American stoves tend to be very, very powerful. Yeah. And so I think sometimes the water would evaporate too fast.
Yeah.
So in a dish like this, because of course, you know, I've made paella, I've had spectacular failures with arroz con pollo, with like something overcooked and something undercooked. Is there a point at which you can just like lift the lid, test the rice, and add like, is there a way to rescue it maybe after the first 15 minutes of cooking? Is there any kind of test you can do?
I think that from my experience, as I described a failure with this dish before, but it's you want to get to the stage where the rice hasn't kind of, you know, at some point rice stops absorbing, and I think you need to make sure that the rice, if you do lift the lid, let's say after 10 minutes of cooking, and you see that there's going to be hardly any water left for the rice to absorb, later on I would top it up with a little bit of boiling stock. It's important that it's hot so it doesn't bring down the temperature. And that would save it. And yeah, but like Sami suggested, I mean, if you have a sense that the chicken is slightly bigger than, you know, it's a kind of an intuition thing, but I think it's better to overcook the chicken than to undercook the rice, because the rice can be overcooked a little bit. You can still eat it, but you know, raw chicken is not great. So I would say, if you're in doubt, cut the chicken pieces a bit smaller.
And what is many readers wanted to know what the towel was for, the mysterious towel. Now, do you put that on once the rice, like once it already tastes cooked to you, once it's tender through, you know, through to the kernel?
Yeah, I mean, I answered somebody on Twitter today about it.
That was me actually.
That was you. Because somebody asked you why do you put the towel, and you said I have no idea, but this is what the recipe says. Whenever I mean, it runs in the family now that whenever they cook rice, when you finish cooking it, you let it rest for at least 10 minutes, and you cover the top with a clean towel and then the lid on. This is just to for the towel to absorb all the humidity and so the water doesn't drip back to the rice and make it even soggier.
Yeah, sometimes if you put the lid on without for the last bit where the rice just finishes cooking, you get these drops of water coming off the lid.
And from the steam to the lid, and then it goes back. The towel sucks the dripping back.
And I think it creates a uniform steam around the top that you don't get with the lid.
So,
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. The resting is really important, and it can even redistribute the liquid and the heat in such a way that I think the rice can actually become more perfectly cooked, even if when you first taste it, it doesn't seem like it's perfectly cooked.
I think so, completely.
And also, one more thing I just wanted to add. I mean, you bring it to a boil, and then make sure that all the rice is covered or under the water. So, you know, even if you see that a few grains are kind of floating or on top of the chicken, push them back into the water. It helps as well.
I think one clarification that would have really helped me is you say in the recipe 2 1/4 cups of boiling water. I mean, I knew that. Well, at least what I did is I first boiled a lot of water and then I measured out 2 1/4 cups of water at boiling temperature. I think what someone might do is actually boil the water first and then, you know, before, like, measure it first, then boil it, and you're going to lose so much moisture.
There you see, lies a real big problem, because when you boil it, there's evaporation. Who knows how long you're going to keep the water there? You might end up with half a cup. So, because this is actually true. I mean, when you tell people to boil the water, they might leave it, or, you know, something happens, you leave it for 5 minutes, you might lose quite a substantial amount of water. So I know it's a bit tricky, and you risk burns, but then again, you know, what's kitchen cooking?
It's always the challenge in recipe writing is how much, you know, I mean, a recipe like this could probably be, you know, 14 pages long if you really went into a great deal of detail. So that's part of why we love doing Recipe Lab, because it's so interesting to see all the different ways that people interpret the recipe itself. There were a lot of questions about the whole spices. Americans, we're not so used to that. Sanjay, can you talk about the spices in the dish a little bit? Because I know that you have a little higher comfort level with that.
Sure. So, you know, I have this experience growing up as a kid. We use whole cloves in rice a lot, and then you bite into a whole clove when you're eating, and it just ruins the entire meal for me and all my siblings. Like, we used to hunt through the rice and try and remove it. So I was wondering if you've ever experimented with, you know, tying up the whole spices in the cheesecloth and then putting them in the rice in the water so that it kind of infuses, but you can pull them out really easily. Because I don't like having whole spices in any of my food dishes.
Well, I'm different. I mean, I think there is a kind of there's two sides to this question. I think it's a bit like the French bouquet garni. You know, you can do a French bouquet garni and then lift it all out, but then I think I want to be reminded of what was in there when I actually eat. You know, I don't want to just have that hint of thyme that might have gone into a muslin and then disappeared as soon as the soup or stew comes off the heat. I want to see the thyme, and I don't personally mind, you know, a cardamom seed or a whole clove kind of in the mouth. You sort of hit on it. You might want to take it out. You might bite into it and eat it. But me personally, I actually like all these kind of to see all the spices. And, you know, when someone eats the rice, they can really appreciate all the stuff that's gone into it, because I think these things are very luscious. They're very sensual. You know, the cardamom pod is a beautiful thing. I want to bring it to the table. So that's my thing. But I think if I minded cloves so much, maybe I would have chosen your solution.
Well, I think one of the things, specifically with cloves, of course, is that the oil is so strong that if you do bite it the wrong way, it can actually numb your mouth, and it's hard to taste anything else. It's not just the feeling of biting down on that little nub, which most people, I think, wouldn't mind. But Sanjay, so was this a dish where you found the spices familiar, or, you know, was it? Did you feel like there could be heat in it, or was it really just a good combination that sort of was logical for you?
I think it was a very logical combination. I think the pepper is key. It adds that spiciness without needing any chilies or anything else that provide heat. And I think it has the cinnamon and the cardamom, which are two of the main spices that we use when we make similar rice pilafs. So I thought the spices were very logical. I thought the dill was brilliant. That was, for me, the crowning touch on that dish. It interacted really well with the spices.
Yeah,
that combination. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, I was curious about that combination of fresh herbs because we tend to just use one, and I know that there are a lot of places where you can kind of buy them, a sort of flavor spectrum altogether in the market. Is that how it is in Jerusalem?
Yeah, very much so. And I think there is a kind of a group of herbs that we tend to kind of use together or in tandem. I mean, many people don't realize that dill is very popular around the Middle East. It always sounds like a very Northern European herb. But in actual fact, it's very popular in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Palestine, Israel, and further east. And it works really well with other kind of herbs that have a slight aniseedy kind of hint to them, like coriander. So like dill and coriander work really well together, and sometimes coriander and mint work really well together. So
tarragon.
And tarragon. So we have this. I think what Sami and I often do is take the herbs that rhyme, that go well together. We have marjoram oregano and fresh za'atar, and put them all together, and then you get that kind of sense that there's few more layers and a few more dimensions to the herb aspect of the dish, and it's a bit like the three spices, the cinnamon, the clove, and the cardamom. It's the same kind of effect. You get like one little surprise and another little surprise, and the third one. That's how we layer our dishes with flavor.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit because I know we could talk about za'atar probably for a whole hour and the people, what it is and how it's used, and also there's lots of sumac in your book, which is such a lovely sour flavor that I think Americans are not that used to. Kirsten, I was wondering if you had any trouble finding any of the ingredients because they're not, in every American supermarket at this point.
Yes, I didn't have any trouble finding most of the ingredients, but the barberries did provide a bit of a challenge, and I was never able to locate them, and so I did use currants as a substitution, and I thought they worked really well. But on the subject of the whole spices, I actually ground them a bit with a mortar and pestle before I put them into the rice, and I'm not sure if that's something you would recommend, but it seemed to work really well for me.
Absolutely.
As I said before, I mean, we are happy that people actually adapt their recipes to their liking.
Yeah, and it's like again, like just to reiterate, if someone doesn't like a whole spice, then there's no use, having them. And very often the whole dish would taste almost as good with a little alteration that suits you. And we are always say, people say, you use all these crazy ingredients, and what's going on, and how we're going to get them, and they get really, or sometimes they become quite stressed about it. And I always say, so leave out one ingredient. It's not the end of the world. Have you seen the ingredient list? It's endless. So it's those kind of adaptations are very welcome as far as we're concerned, and the recipes are there to have fun with, not to feel guilty about not complying with the instructions.
Some people want to stay true to the recipe,
but I think it's fine not to.
I noticed
Ruth. I just wanted to ask Ruth a question because I think a lot of people think of Jerusalem and much of Israel as being just desert, and there's such a presence of vegetables and produce and amazing fruits in your book and all of these salads. So, I mean, you guys can talk about this, of course, but I also wanted to ask Ruth, does the book does this recipe in particular seem to kind of go with the traditional marketplace, at least, of Jerusalem? Because I know that there's a lot of extra things.
Well, totally. This is local. I mean, and this has been local for generations. I think the only thing that's really changed is just the plenty. There's just mounds and mounds and piles, and it's just, I walk in, I'm like so inspired each and every time I go to the market, just by the quantity and the quality of the produce and the variety also. So yeah, this is normal for me, all of this stuff, and I don't find it challenging. In fact, it's just a pleasure to be able to take the list and just to go out and get everything. It's fun.
Yeah. I just want to talk about barberries for a second. They are the most challenging ingredient to get in this particular recipe, because it's not difficult. It's just I researched it a little bit when we were writing the book, and apparently they were quite common in European diet up until about the 19th century, and then somehow they went out of favor. But it's the only places where they still use them regularly in cooking are Iran and Turkey and that part of the world. But they are really, really fantastic. I mean, they've got this kind of beautiful sweet, but more sharp than anything else. That is something that I think with time people will discover and will figure in more and more dishes. We use them a few times in the book, and they're just fantastic. And so you really need to go to a specialized Middle Eastern grocer to get them, but I think it's really, really worth it.
Mm-hmm. Today I substituted cranberries because I was out of the barberries, and it was very nice. It was unsweetened, the unsweetened ones. It was fine.
And
those are very popular here.
Dried sour cherries are also good.
People have used a lot of different kinds of dried fruit, and you really just want that note of sweetness, like in the baby spinach salad with the dates. I've tried that with a lot of different ones, different fruits as well. So we sort of also wanted to talk about, the things that make this book so, not only this recipe, but the things that we think have made this book so popular. So what are some other cookbooks, like for our home cooks, that are on your shelves that you use a lot? Or I know, Kirsten, you must have just started cooking, you're young, but do you have other books that you turn to, or?
Yes, well, I think the first cookbook that I really took to was The Art of Simple Food by Alice Waters. And I think there's sort of a similar thought behind both of these two books, in that I learn so much every time I prepare a dish from either one of them. And so that really helps me with beginning to cook all of my own meals. But the dishes are not out of reach in any way, and I find that a lot of them are very forgiving. So like with this, when I was making the chicken and rice, the rice was undercooked, but I was able to take the chicken out and continue cooking the rice afterwards, and everything was able to be salvaged, and it turned out beautifully. And I also learned, because I was able to quarter a chicken for the first time ever, which was definitely a learning experience for me. So I think that that's really something that I appreciate a lot about the book.
And what about, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I've never cooked as much out of one book in a couple of days that I have out of this one. I've done 4 dishes in 2 days now. None of the other books really are as accessible and have as much history and anthropology attached to them. It's really nice when you're cooking a dish to be able to know the kind of setting it was served in, and the type of people that eat it when they cook it every day. And I think that really makes you look at a dish, it pops out of the page at you, and you really just want to go and cook it immediately. Especially when the flavors are so enticing, and in some of the recipes very otherworldly for me. So
otherworldly, I like that.
Ruth, when you moved, you uprooted your whole life and therefore your whole kitchen, and changed from an American cook to being an Israeli cook. Were there books that helped you in that transition, or did you have to just feel it out as you went?
Well, first of all, I came to Israel when I was like 19. So I wasn't much of a cook then. I started really cooking when I had my own family. And so I sort of, as a cook, I think I developed and grew up mostly here. I don't know, I just learned from people more so than from cookbooks. But there are some good local cookbooks that are here, and I just find personally the internet is my source of inspiration. Anything I want to cook, I just go online and it's there. What I love about this particular cookbook is it brings the flavor of the city to life to people that don't necessarily have access to it, and I think that's a gift.
And Yotam and Sami, obviously you grew up in Jerusalem, but you left when you were, like Ruth, young people, not cooks. And now you cook in London, a very sophisticated city, and you sort of cook not Israeli food, but Mediterranean food. Are there books that helped you get from one place to another?
I personally have tons of books. It's endless. Like, if I take my computer to the kitchen, there's I'm a cookbook addict, and I also love Alice Waters and all the recipes that come out of the Japanese and Californian tradition of cooking. I think there is something very honest about cooking with clear ingredients and keeping the the integrity of the ingredients throughout the cooking. And one of the things, I mean, I think our food is probably more busier, I'd say, because there's more use of spices and herbs, and probably we use more ingredients in each dish than you would find in a traditional kind of Californian cookbook. But there is a sense that there is a few core ingredients in a recipe, and they have a very clear voice, and that's the voice of the dish. And this is, I think, something that I've taken from Californian cooking, and really kind of I want to make sure that every ingredient within this dish has a very clear voice, and that you really know what you're eating. And that goes back to the point I mentioned earlier about the cardamom staying in the rice and the cloves staying in the rice, and kind of having a very honest facade, or a very honest feel to a dish when you actually eat it, and it has to be very close to what it was, so it's not overly processed.
We have a comment from a reader who is going back to the chicken with onions dish, saying that he thinks that it's actually a part of why people love it so much is that it is so symbolic and also so delicious, but also symbolic and a reminder of how cultures and cuisines are intertwined in the region. Do you think that that's true? Is this a good example of that? I found, for me, it was interesting, the caramelized onions, which I know is a Turkish and a majedra, a wonderful dish of rice and lentils and caramelized onions, which is so inexpensive and just such everyday comfort food. So that caramelized onions, but also with the brown chicken, also seemed sort of like my grandmother's cooking. And maybe everyone feels that way. What do you guys have to say about that cultural back and forth? I know it's a complicated subject, of course.
I think it's one of those. I mean, this is true about probably about 40 or 50% of the recipes in the book, that they draw inspiration of various cultures, and they don't belong to one culture. They belong to various cultures because there's some kind of cross hybrid that we managed to create while we were working on the book, and this is definitely one of them. I wouldn't say this is something that one community would eat, but I can definitely see a Palestinian family eating something like that, perhaps without the barberries, but all the rest would be just the same.
It feels like a dish that traveled, through the history and changed slightly each kind of decade or two, or each house will add or take away ingredients to basically do it their own.
Absolutely. And when we were researching the book, we found out that often we started off with one dish with a certain name, and it ended up being so similar to another dish from a different community with a different name that you ended up having to tell a very long story before you even start cooking, because the Jews of Georgia cook very similarly to the Arabs of East Jerusalem, because they both use beetroot, and they both use walnuts, and they both use pomegranates. So when you start to kind of work on a recipe, you realize actually there's a very similar thing. Then you have to start from the beginning and say, okay, well, which is the original? Which story do you tell first? And these are dilemmas that we had throughout. So often the recipes ended up being kind of cross hybrids rather than the original one and only recipe that belongs to one community. But that makes the stories more interesting, I find.
Yeah, and that's certainly a familiar dilemma in writing and thinking about cooking in America. And as American cooks, where does it begin? How is it all intertwined? Who invented it? But that's all the time we have. I'm sure we could talk about that for hours and days. But thank you so much for having us
Thanks, Julia.
at your homes, on your computers. And I hope you'll come and find us at NewYorkTimes.com for recipelab.nyt dining. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
everybody. Thank you.